is actually a presentation about the Cyber Resilience Act that was mentioned before. Let's start from who I am. So I'm working for Open Exchange, which is a German open source software company. We make email and DNS software. You might know if you use Linux, Dovecot, which is the most widely used IMAP server, or Power DNS, which is a very common DNS resolver. So we are an open core company, thinking of the business models. 90% of what we do is fully free software, and we sell the 10% of extensions, which are closed to pay for everything. And personally, I've been involved in this kind of internal governance stuff for like 25 years now, so I'm an old guy. So before coming to the Cyber Resilience Act, and explaining you why you should care about a piece of European regulation while in Vietnam or in Asia in general, we have to understand that the approach that Europe has to internet regulation, which is an approach of, let's say, the third way between the US and China. So from the European perspective, Europe has sort of lost the race to the internet industry because most of the big tech companies are Americans. There's very few very big internet companies in Europe, maybe Spotify, Booking, which is Dutch but is owned by Americans. So the feeling is that sort of Europe lost the train and now has a big problem in terms of economy and also in terms of national security, independence. And so the only way that Europe has to address this problem is to make laws, regulation. This is a European specialty. And so the approach is to try to obtain what is called in Europe digital sovereignty, which is a mix of a lot of things. But it basically means to be self-sufficient and not depend on other countries, even if friendly or not friendly, it doesn't care, but other countries for basic internet services like the ones we use every day, because all of our society and economy depends on internet services. And so promote, local alternatives, try to build European alternatives, and this includes open source. So there's a big push on open source by European authorities because it's seen as a way to promote the birth of alternatives to the big tech companies. But also there's a matter of economy, basically. Of course, all these services, cloud services that are bought from European companies, they are bought from American suppliers, or from Chinese, for example, hardware suppliers, or from other countries. It's money that goes somewhere else. It's a loss in tax revenue. And so this is also, there's a loss in tax revenue. And so this is a loss of money as well. And this is why Europe is really trying to build some kind of independence. And so this is why the approach of Europe is global. So the only thing that Europe can say is that we as Europe are a very big economy. So of course it's divided in 27 smaller economies and countries, but if you put the whole of the European Union together, it's almost similar to China in terms of the size. It's actually slightly bigger, so it's like the second economy in the world. And so the approach by the European authorities is anyone in the world will want to sell products in Europe. And so they will have to accept whatever laws we make, whatever rules we want, to be enabled to sell in Europe. Otherwise, we will start to fine them. And you might heard, if you listen, recently Europe has fined Apple for several billion euros or dollars for a number of privacy issues and competition issues. So we'll start to ask them money, fine them, and in the worst case, we will prevent them from entering the European market. And since everybody cares about the European market, of course, we are pretty sure that everybody will comply with the laws. And so this is a so-called Brussels effect. Because in fact, this is what happens. Usually Europe starts with some laws. You might have heard about the GDPR, which is the privacy regulation, because then it starts to become a model for the rest of the world. And the global internet platforms have to comply with the European regulation, and so they change their products. And often they end up changing their products also in other countries. And so the other countries also follow the same model as Europe, for example, in terms of privacy regulation. And so, given the success of the GDPR, which was the first one, now in the last few years, we've seen several new laws coming from Europe, just approved last year or so. The Digital Markets Act about competition, and others are about content regulation and a number of things, AI. So this is the background for the talk, which is about the code like hairdryers, as you will see, or the Cyber Resilience Act. So if you ever worked for a company that sends products to Europe or builds products for European customers or European wholesalers, you know the CE mark. So any kind of hardware piece, even appliances from hairdryers, of course, but also mobile phones, to be sold in Europe needs to have the CE mark. Even I have a Xiaomi phone. My Xiaomi phone has a label with the CE mark. Otherwise, I would not have been able to buy it in Europe. And so traditionally, even if you're a Chinese or an Asian supplier, you have to get this mark, which means that you have to follow a set of specifications for the safety, the electrical safety, the physical safety, and also the electronic behavior of the product. And in some cases, you have to get a certification from a third party. In other cases, you just have to follow the rules, and then you say, okay, I follow the rules, so I can get the CE mark. So, for example, if you take a hairdryer, this is a hairdryer made in China, and there's a CE mark that shows that it complies. So what happens now? The European authorities were worried, mostly by Log4j, we all know, but in general by the fact that software is now everywhere, and so bugs, vulnerabilities can really bring down the society, can stop the internet from working, and can stop companies, they can stop hospitals, and so they want more secure software. And so the great idea that people in Brussels said, why don't we ask software makers to put the CE mark on software as well? Which is, of course, not so clear. How can you put a CE mark on a piece of software, on a set of code lines? But this is what in the law. So they made this new piece of law, which applies to products with digital elements, which is basically any object that has hardware and or software. So it's an IoT device with some hardware and some software, but also just software. And so it includes also the cloud part. So as long as it is connected to the internet, it falls under this law, and it includes the cloud server part, so the code that runs on the server. And this, of course, was a problem for the open source community. So this came out, the first draft of this law came out about 18 months ago. And it was a shock for the open source community, like us, but also like the foundations and everybody that cares about the open source movement in Europe. Because it's the first time that someone tries to regulate the way you make the code and to tell you how you make your code secure and to maybe give you punishment if you don't follow certain practices. And at the beginning, we were like, no, we don't want to be regulated. You cannot regulate code. I mean, open source is produced collaboratively by people all around the world. How can you check what they do? How can you put stamps? So do we have to certify, get the CE mark on every new version, every new release, every new line of code that they put in the repository? This can never work. And also, there were arguments about free speech. Traditionally, software is seen as a form of free speech in the US, in Europe. And so you should not be able to prevent someone from publishing software. And I mean, basically, there was this discussion in which the European authorities kept saying, yes, but people will just do whatever we want because they need to sell their software in Europe. And we would reply, but open source is not always a commercial product. People don't sell it in general. So, I mean, there are people would like, close down the repositories to Europe and make the software unavailable rather than, spend money and energies to comply with bureaucracy to certify the security of the code. But in the end, the feedback was that, it's really time for the software industry to become professional, and this includes the open source industry. So it's actually an objective of the European Commission to have less hobbyist projects and more companies around open source. And this was said very clearly. And so companies have to take reliability, have to follow by the rules, and the whole of the software world has to become professional, whatever that means. So we worked for 1 year with the European authorities, trying to convince them to change draft. It's a complex process. I won't enter into the details. But in the end, after 1 year of negotiation, we got into this thing, which I will now explain. And basically, it's an algorithm that we made from the final text of the law to decide whether you are or are not affected by this regulation if you are making open source software. So basically, there's a couple of situations. The most common one is that you will be a manufacturer of software. So if you make the code, so if you are the entity that owns the code, like a company that runs the project or even a non-profit entity that runs the project, but you control the development, so you're like the main maintainer or like controlling the commits, and you make money out of it. And this is very broad. It's not just selling the software, it's also selling services around the software. It's also accepting donations around the software, especially if you maybe something of the domain name remains to you. So you don't just pay costs, but you maybe get some sort of salary from the donations you receive. then you are subject to this law, even if you are basically a non-profit, even if you are an individual. But as long as the software has some kind of commercial use, so it's used in products, as we said, products that have some digital elements. And if you are considered a manufacturer, so you meet these conditions, you will have to follow the best practices that are said in the law, which include, well, I will also get into this, but basically it's about following very basic, I'd say, cybersecurity practices that we should all follow anyway, so it's nothing really new. And provide the security patches throughout the life cycle of the software. So keep fixing the vulnerabilities when they are found and report the breaches to the European authorities, which was also a subject of contention because not everyone likes to report vulnerabilities to a government. But I mean, in the end, this is part of the obligation. And if you do all of these, you can get the CE mark. And so you can basically distribute all software in Europe. Then there's another case. If you are not a manufacturer, but you are an open source software steward, and this is a special role that was created basically for the big foundations, like Apache Foundation, Eclipse Foundation. And these are entities that don't write the code themselves, but they host the projects. So they say, we don't write the code, we cannot be responsible for the code, but still they host it, and so they got a smaller set of responsibilities, like checking what the projects do and making sure that they follow the practices and cooperating with the authorities if there's a vulnerability and so on. And this applies basically to entities, juridical entities, not people, that host projects, that are not manufacturers, but host projects that may be used in products, in commercial products, and basically support the development of projects. And otherwise, if you don't meet these requirements, you're not affected by the law. So if you're just a random developer that is contributing code to other people's projects, then you're fine. You don't need to worry. It's basically the owner of the project that will have to comply with the law. Or if you don't make money anyway, so if the project is completely for free, there is no donation, no money collection, no services, nothing, then of course you're out of scope. Or if you're just supporting stuff as an individual, basically. Or if your project has no commercial interest, meaning that it's not used in any product that is sold anywhere in Europe. But you know, the problem is that when you make a project and put it online, you never know who is going to use it. So if someone takes it and puts it into a commercial product in Europe, then you are responsible. And this is part of the problem, and this is part of why you should care. So let's say you are recognized as a code manufacturer, an open source code manufacturer, then this is what you have to do. I mean, this is very short. There will be pages and pages and pages written on what you have to do, but this is a short summary from what is in the law, which is basically never ship with any known vulnerability. By the way, the first draft of the law said never ship with any vulnerability, and it's clearly impossible to do. And even here, I mean, we managed to get the word known, and some clauses like, well, if it's really necessary, maybe you can ship with something minor if you need to push out a major fix or something like that. And so you have provide secure configurations, authenticate in a secure way, so no more default username admin, default password admin, and these kind of things. Encrypt your communications, track the upstream vulnerabilities of all the libraries you use, and disclose the vulnerabilities with care, but disclose them as soon as possible. And so do you need a certification? So one of the concerns was, as an open source project, especially the community one, I don't have a lot of money. So do I have to pay some company that checks my code and releases a certificate that the code is secure? And the answer, fortunately, is generally no. There is just one case in which you have to get a third party to assess your code and do an audit, which is if you make this kind of security-based product. So if you make smart cards, or hardware security stuff, encryption stuff, then you might have to get a third-party certificate to get the CE mark. Otherwise, you just have to write a document and maybe put it in a file together with a license and say that you followed all the best practices that are required by the law. And so in practice, which practices do you have to follow? Because it's easy to say, I have to check all the code for vulnerabilities, but in practice, what do you have to do? Especially if you have to prove that you did it, it's very important to be sure of exactly what you have to do. And this is going to be the work of the next 1 or 2 years. So there will be basically European standardization bodies, SENS and LEC or others, that will provide standards. I mean, like several, dozens of pages of guides of what you have to do depending on which kind of software and what you do. So this is still to be done, and the community in Brussels is organizing to be part of the process and make sure that what comes out of this is actually reasonable. And if you rather have other parties imports, this is especially true of like IoT stuff or devices, then it's the importer that has to do this. So you might also find someone who is buying your product here and importing it in Europe, and then it's their responsibility to check the CE mark, validate the code, and be responsible for everything into the law. And also, the integrators may be responsible. So there was a question by the Debian community, like, okay, we have a small PC shop that takes a laptop and installs Debian and downloads packages. Who is responsible for making sure that the packages are okay, are not vulnerable? And in that case, the PC shop is responsible, according to the European authorities, because they are integrating other products, and so they have to check package by package that the package is certified or at least is meeting the requirements of the law. And so this is also something that is not so nice. Of course, fortunately, this is not already in place. The text is now approved. So we have the law is finally approved. There's still a couple of validation phases, but in the end, it will enter into force by the end of this year. And then there's depending on which section of the law, there's like 2 or 3 years for compliance. So in the end, this is something that will have to be done in place by 2026, 27, not immediate. But still, you have to start thinking of this. And also, the US government now is starting to think at the same topic. And so they are also starting to think at something maybe lighter than this, with less obligations, because the US has a usually much lighter regulation. But it might be that also to bring your software into the US, you will have to comply with these kind of things. And so what I wanted to do here is just to give you a heads up and a very brief introduction and explain that this is coming. And if you're interested in working on global projects or distributing your products globally, then you have to take care about this. Thank you.